When I began this work, my main focus was female reproductive cycles, the menstrual cycle. And when I began this work, what I did was help educate women on their bodies and how they could maybe fix some symptoms that they were having associated with their menstrual cycle. There's a lot of dysfunction that exists out there with the menstrual cycle. Quite often, we outsource our agency, our sovereignty to a public school system. We outsource to something other than ourselves, right? We trust our physicians, carte blanche. We, some of us trust the government, carte blanche. I think man-made creations may tend to be those things that don't echo nature. At some point along the way, humans, decided that we needed to dominate nature rather than be a part of it. We need to find other ways to live sustainably in sync with nature without dominating it, without paving it all over, without breaking down those natural systems and structures. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but here we go. What was that first wave of feminism about? I'm not really sure. It was about liberating women completely.
The following podcast is for educational purposes only and contains material that may not be suited for sensitive audience members. Audience discretion is advised. Welcome everybody to another episode of the Health King's Court, Ancient Wisdom for Modern Health. I'm your host, Zach the Health King. I have a very interesting guest with me today with a lot of diverse areas of expertise. She's a cycle alchemist, an organic farmer, an astrologer, plant keeper and plant witch, a somatic embodiment facilitator, and feminine embodiment muse. As a certified reproductive health educator, she helps women liberate themselves into their most delicious, deeply satisfying, and purpose-filled life. Finding the magic in the mundane, she guides people through self-transformation with her framework of the 4 Ps: planets, plants, pussy, and personal agency. With her work, she hopes to lead by example and inspire others to live sovereign with purpose and intention. And that is Tere Marie. Tere, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, Zach. Happy to be here today. Thanks for having me.
Super happy to have you on. And so let's start by defining some terms that even right in that introduction, people might not have understood. Yeah. What is cycle alchemy to you? And what does it mean to be a cycle alchemist?
Yeah, that's a great question. So cycles can, it's kind of the umbrella term for all of the work that I do, the 4 Ps, the plants, planets, pussy, personal agency piece that you listed. When I began this work, my main focus was female reproductive cycles, the menstrual cycle. And when I began this work, what I did was help educate women on their bodies and how they could maybe fix some symptoms that they were having associated with their menstrual cycle. There's a lot of dysfunction that exists out there with the menstrual cycle. So that's how it kind of started, with focusing on that cycle. And then as I got deeper and deeper into the work, I started to look at all these other aspects of the work that I did, the astrology, which is really just the story of the cycles the planets have with each other and the sun. Plants, which exist in the natural world, which we know is just really works with the cycles and the seasons in our natural environment. And then our own personal cycles, right? So we all kind of go through these phases where we're in production mode, we're in rest mode, we're kind of constantly cycling through. So that's kind of where the cycle alchemist all came together, as I was like, wait a minute. I was like, instead of just focusing on this one cycle, the menstrual cycle, really everywhere we look in our day-to-day lives is a symphony of different overlapping cycles. So that's kind of where the term came together.
Yeah, that's absolutely beautiful because you're correct. All things in life are cyclical in nature, whether people realize it or not. Nothing is linear. All things are happening in some sort of wave-like pattern. There's uptrends, there's downtrends, there's higher highs, there's higher lows, there's lower lows, there's lower highs. And everything is kind of happening in this kind of way, or even if it's not overall going up or down, it's still not linear. There's still just patterns and change and movement and rhythm in all things, whether it's so interesting how fractalized everything is. We could talk about human behavior, we could talk about menstrual cycles and innate body processes, but we could also talk about the reason that we're able to even speak to each other because our bodies are producing cycles, they're producing waves that are audible to our body, that our body is able to then pick up. It's so interesting how disconnected an average person is from the cyclical nature of the world and the wave-like vibrational nature of the world that is so present in everything, even physical matter. It's certainly very interesting. And
Yeah.
so there's another term you use right in the introduction, or I used in the introduction off your materials, and that
Mhm.
is to live sovereignly. And your
Yeah.
intention is to help people live sovereignly.
Yeah.
What does
Yeah.
that mean to you?
Yeah, that's an interesting one because as humans, we truly exist in community. We're herd animals, right? Like no human out in the elements in nature can survive very long on their own. Well, we've all heard stories of people, living for, but we're not meant to live as solitary creatures. But we are meant to have a sense of sovereignty, of personal agency, of ownership over our bodies and ourselves. And quite often, we outsource our agency, our sovereignty to for when we're children, a public school system, which good, better, and different, they exist. And I am glad that they do. But we outsource to something other than ourselves, right? We trust our physicians, carte blanche. Some of us trust the government, carte blanche. What this idea of sovereignty doesn't mean that we exist in a vacuum by ourselves and we don't need anybody else. We don't need community. We don't need intimacy. We don't need connection. None of that. But what it says is that we are thinking, inquisitive, intelligent beings that can create the life that we desire out of our desires, right? Out of our truest heart's desires, that we don't have to buy into or prescribe to any other system that somebody else told us we should. In fact, that linear outlook often comes from the systems around us, right? We're taught to go to primary school, go to high school, go to college, get a job, work for the company for 50 years, retire on, the whole nine yards. And I encourage people to push back on that and to really lean into what's true for your heart's desire rather than what an outside source told you how you should be living, including me. I mean, I could be full of bullshit too, right? So like question me
Yeah.
also. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's a shame how many people aren't in the driver's seat of their own life and really never have been. And so essentially what you're advocating for is self-empowerment and
Mhm.
getting back in that driver's seat, understanding what road you're on, understanding what the steering wheel looks like and how it works and the gas pedal and figuring that out and then being able to go where you want to or need to or are meant to go,
Yep.
essentially.
I love that analogy. That's a great way to put it. Knowing what the steering wheel looks like, right? And it's just wild to me how many people just don't know that they have a say and they have a choice in the own trajectory of their lives, right? When I first began this work, I was a doula, and a doula is generally another woman who assists others during childbirth. And during those childbirth experiences with other women in the delivery room, in the hospital setting, or in the home setting, it just blew my mind how many women didn't know that they had the option to ask their physician, can I have 5 more minutes to make this decision? Are there any other options? The physician would come in and say, we're ready to induce you, or we're ready to do a C-section. And they would just be like, okay. And, part of your job as a doula, air quotes, is to say, pause. Are you okay with that decision? Would you like to hear some other options? Would you like to reflect on your birth plan or um, how you'd like to approach this birth rather than how your physician did. And I'm not here to tear down relationships between practitioners and people by any means. I mean, I think it should be a beautiful collaborative relationship. We should trust our physicians, but we should question them. We should have agency
We
in
should
that.
be able to and not have had that trust broken every
Yep.
single occurrence of interaction, and the business of being born and the business of birth is one of the most dirty and degenerate and disgusting and truly disturbing businesses out there when you come to comprehend its
Mm.
modern iteration and how it occurs. It's one of those ones that gets me fired up,
Mm.
as
Mm-hmm.
as
Mm-hmm.
a protector of persons when people don't stand a chance against what's being acted upon them, such as unborn children or freshborn children or even vulnerable pregnant mothers.
Yeah.
That the preying upon them absolutely disturbs me to my core. But
Yeah. 100%.
yeah, that's a whole thing going on there.
Yeah.
So is there anything in life that isn't cyclical? Is there anything that doesn't apply to these natural orders and natural laws and rules in some way?
Yeah, are the capitalist society that we live in, the society that we construct that tells us we need to live in a linear fashion, right? Maybe some types of mathematics. I'm not a math pro. Um, but as we know, there's so much nuance in the natural world, right? I think man-made creations may tend to be those things that don't echo nature. At some point along the way, humans, decided that we needed to dominate nature rather than be a part of it. I mean, look at us. Like we are made up of everything that exists in our natural world, right? In our solar system, we're literally made of stardust, right? The same elements that are in the stars are in our bodies, in our blood. But at some point in history, we decided that we needed to dominate and control the lands rather than live with them, right? And, we have to be realistic at the same time. I couldn't throw the number out there of what the population of the world is right now, but it's huge, right? Like, not all of us can live subsistence lifestyles on this planet right now. There's just a lot of people. We need to find other ways to live sustainably in sync with nature without dominating it, without paving it all over, without breaking down those natural systems and structures.
What
Yeah.
was that word you used? Subsistence?
Subsistence, as in living off the land, right? Maybe you live off grid, you grow your own food, you gather your own water, you build your own house, kind of like subsistence. Yeah, that's.
Got it. Got it. Yeah, we've certainly separated from that pathway so far as a collective that it would certainly be difficult at the least to one even convince anyone to do that, but two to structurally and infrastructurally completely flip everything upside down. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
a beautiful dream, perhaps, but let's of
not
course
very realistic.
we
Yeah,
agree that let's talk about what we could do in
yeah,
reality. And
totally.
so, is it possible for people to ignore or to not comprehend the cyclical nature of reality and how things exist in waves and cycles and truly live an effective and satisfied life? Can we ignore this part of reality because when it's so ingrained in ourselves?
I think delusion is really interesting, and we can we can convince ourselves of anything, but I don't have any data to back this. This is purely my opinion.
No
I think
science nerds here. Don't care about data. Let's hear it.
the incidence of mental illness, of dissatisfaction in life, depression, anxiety, I happen to think that that is probably correlated with our removal from nature, with our removal from those cycles, those systems, that understanding that, you know what? There are times where, like you said, we feel a little low. There are times when we feel a little high. I mean, there is a winter. We need to go through that period of dormancy in order to gain our resources to come back to life in the spring, right? But I think removing ourselves from that is really kind of causing a lot of unrest in our society. Um, I think the more we're on our devices, and here we are using the internets to communicate with each other. I like technology. I'm really grateful it exists. But I also, after our call today, I'm going to go be in my greenhouse for the rest of the day and probably transplant, a few thousand tomato plants or something like that. Um, if you just look back to the body, you just can't deny that it exists. I love to look to the wisdom of the body to teach us lessons, right? So um, we look to the breath, right? That's a cycle. You don't even have to think about it. Your lungs just inhale and inflate and deflate on their own time. You don't have to force anything. You don't stay, your lungs don't stay collapsed, empty for very long. They don't stay totally full for very long. You just keep going. You don't have to think about your heartbeat. Your heart is a muscle that just keeps going and going and going. But what else does the heart do? It rests in between the beats. If if you're to break down the amount of time where the heart is contracting and beating and in rest, our heart actually rests more than it beats.
Hmm.
So if that isn't a lesson that in order to be functional and survive and keep our systems going, we need more rest than we do activity. I am being a big fat hypocrite when I say that because I am a person who has a lot of fire in me, a lot of energy, a lot of creation, drive to create, right? So I'm go, go, go. I have to actively remind myself to rest, that it's okay to rest, to look to my heartbeat, to look to the cycles and seasons, to look to my menstrual cycle, to inform me on how important it is to recharge, to rest.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And there's always the micro cycles and then the macro cycles within your current ways of operating where you are perhaps resting this much and working this much and kind of experiencing those waves. Then there's the larger scale cycle where, okay, that's the larger cycle that you're in right now. And then at a different phase, you'll have a different shift and it'll kind of have different relations of the two. And so, it's like the fractal nature again. There's the mini cycles that exist within the larger ones. And then we have to understand. And then, of course, simultaneously, as your work rest cycles are going on, certainly your menstrual cycles are going on. And there's all these intersectings, like you mentioned at the beginning, that we need to comprehend in order to most effectively and optimally not only get external work done, but also maintain our internal state and health.
Mhm.
It's interesting that you bring up the seasons because that's an interesting thing right there. And it is a great demonstration of the corruption of nature and natural cycles and the disconnect that people are living in that they don't even realize. Because while the earth goes through the seasonal cycles and, of course, different geographic locations experience it differently,
Mhm.
it's evident that the other species of life comprehend that the new cycle begins in the spring and like that's their beginning of cycle. That's the rebirth. That's life.
Mhm.
And yet, we as humans have at some point agreed, at least in the calendar that we operate on, that the new year, for some reason, is in the dead of winter.
Mm.
Is that something that you've thought about and pondered ever, and the ramifications that that might have as people try to begin their new cycles of life and form their resolutions and kind of the way they structure their life is based off of perhaps a false new year?
Yeah, that's a really interesting subject to think about. I have to tell you honestly, I have no idea why the Gregorian calendar begins in January. No idea. No idea. Um, as an astrologer, I consider the new year to be right around this time of year. Um, The astrological year begins with the sign of Aries. Aries starts the whole zodiac out. It's the most initiatory sign. It's the most masculine, one of the most masculine signs of the whole zodiac. Depending on the year, usually Aries season begins around the middle of March, right? So that's what I've always considered my new year. That is so because of what you just said. That's when spring in the Northern Hemisphere, which is where a lot of astrology began, that's when spring begins. That's when the new year begins, right? Do you have any idea why why they chose January 1st as the I have no idea. That's a great question.
Yeah, I'm not a historian by any means. The Gregorian calendar is interesting, and we could talk about why there's different amounts of days in each month, and how disconnected from the natural cycles that is, and how if each month just had, what is it, 28 or 30 days, whichever number it is, then it would all actually work perfectly instead of there being these weird shifts and then a random leap year. It's a long and interesting conversation of how diverged we've become from the
Yeah.
actual natural rhythms in that way.
Yeah.
Perhaps I'm not the best authority even to speak on
Well, no, that's an interesting question. I'm going to look it up now whenever I think of
it. They
um,
added two random months in at a certain point. It's interesting.
well, if you look at it, I I I can speak in terms of astrology better than I can anything else. So we have 12 signs in the zodiac. We have 12 months in the year. The zodiac itself is a wheel, right? And that represents the sun, the 360 degrees or whatever of the sun. The 12 different signs represent the 12-ish moon phases that we experience over that one rotation around the sun, that 365 degrees around the sun. So I wonder if the calendar years also came from a similar kind of, that's how many, approximately how many lunar cycles we have a year. We do have closer to 13 lunar cycles than 12 lunar cycles, which I
Oh,
believe that's why those funny number of days and the leap year and the this and that probably comes from. Anyways, we could speculate all day, but
yeah, no, absolutely. But it just brings an interesting framework to the conversation because it highlights how disconnected at all levels society is from nature.
yeah,
And if we're fundamentally disconnected at the foundational level of how we even view time and how we view the nature of the world around us, if we're on that unstable or downright false foundation, how can we ever truly find
mm-hmm.
our footing as individuals? And so that's why I encourage these considerations for people who are looking to truly find themselves, because only by knowing where you are can you figure out kind of where you'd like to go, and only can you figure out where you've been, and kind of how things all relate to each other. But
Yeah,
it's a lot of interesting things out there. But one of your main areas of work is working with women specifically in their cycles.
yeah.
And I guess my first question in that is, do you think it's specifically more important due to their biology or emotionality or inherent nature for women to understand and comprehend cycles than men? Is it even more crucial and essential?
I think it's a little more naturally baked into us because we experience those cycles, right?
Yeah.
Like, and I mean, in a very visible, embodied way. Men also go through cycles. And let's talk about the differences between male and female cycles. Men definitely live, if we're strictly speaking in terms of hormones, sex hormones, testosterone, estrogen. Um, Men have a more linear cycle than women do. Generally, men have a little blip of testosterone early in the morning upon waking or so, and then they kind of just flatline out and have that. Many men experience higher libido in the morning because of that, right? A lot of men like to work out in the morning because they have a little more pep in their step, if you will. Um, so even though it is a cycle, it's a little more linear, right? Women have this very diverse ebb and flow of those hormones throughout the month. So I don't know if important is the word I would use to describe it. I think many women might have an easier time understanding it and feeling that embodied approach to cycles, but it's equally as important for humans across the board, whatever you identify as, to be able to embody and understand and tap into that. You don't necessarily have to have a menstrual cycle by any stretch of the imagination, but you can use the seasons and cycles in the natural world, or um, the lunar cycle, or any number of different cycles that we exist in to embody that approach.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Makes sense to me. And
Yeah.
so, why do you think, and this is something that you said before, that there's dysfunction in the menstrual cycle of a lot of women? Why is that so prevalent?
Hmm. Well, here we go.
Certainly have my ideas.
A myriad of reasons, right? A myriad of reasons. One, when we were living a more primal existence, we many scientists theorize that women had fewer cycles. They didn't have a monthly cycle. They may have had like a quarterly cycle, right? And that might be because of how we obtained our nutrition, right? Depending on where you are in the world. And, if you're experiencing harsh winters or easier winters, our bodies need a certain amount of nutrition, certain amount of fats, carbs, macros, to be able to produce the hormones we need to ovulate, to menstruate. The body is always going to prioritize survival over procreation, right? So in those slimmer times of years, maybe there weren't as many menstrual cycles happening. That doesn't really answer your question. Let me go back. Why may we experience so many dysfunctions in our cycles? Hormonal birth control is the number one reason, I think.
Thank
I
you.
mean, preteens are prescribed major hormonal supplement. It's just crazy to me. So a 12-year-old maybe experienced menarche, or the onset of their menstrual cycle. They go to their doctor because they had one cycle and then didn't have a cycle for 3 months. So they go to their doctor and they say, hey, I'm not really sure what's going on here. I don't have a quote regular cycle, meaning a monthly cycle. What does the doctor immediately do? Here's some pills that you can go on that will regulate your cycle,
For the
right?
rest of your life.
For the rest of your life, we'll just suppress your ovulation, right? And what that does is it doesn't give the body time to acclimate, just like any other function or any other skill that you learn, right? Like you're learning to ride a bike. You don't get on that bike the first time and are like, who is it? Lance Armstrong, right? Like you get on the bike and you might fall off a couple times. You might need a couple weeks to get used to it. You might use your training wheels for a while. The body is the same. The first visible cycles, meaning like, actual bleeds that a young person might have, aren't necessarily full on ovulatory cycle menstrual cycles. What that might be is the body slowly ramping its way up, moving towards having that full cascade of hormones. It can take up to 3 to 5 years for a young person to begin to menstruate on a regular basis. So it's just crazy that at first blush, you go to your physician and they're just like, Mary, just go on these pills. So the body never has a chance to fully get up to speed with ovulation, right? So then when that person's 30 and wants to maybe start a family, they transition off birth control and they find that they're not ovulating, you know? Um, so that's a huge reason. I mean, one, all the chemicals that we take as hormonal birth control, all the toxins in our environment mimic estrogen. They can cause some people to have higher amounts of androgens or a lot of testosterone in their system. So again, their hormones aren't functioning normally. There's a lot of light pollution out there, which also can create abnormal hormones. But gosh, there's a lot of reasons why we are having a lot of disruptions in our
Yeah.
cycles, right? And it's
It's like,
all our creation. It's what I think. It's all man's creation, not gentleman man, but
yeah,
human.
yeah.
Yeah.
There's certainly no shortage of endocrine disruptors in
Mm,
every facet of life, everything from the food to the water to the clothing and anything in between. It's disrupting hormones in some way if you are not consciously curating how you are interacting with any of these things. But, I love that it was your first answer because it's absolutely one of the most dangerous and outright scams of the modern world, birth control. The fact that people have been convinced that they can or should, or that it is at all healthy to inundate women with artificial synthetic hormones every single day, year in, year out. And that's a casual thing. I mean, there's few more insane things that have been pulled over on people. I can name a few, but it's certainly up there.
yeah.
It's such a shame. It's absolutely such a shame because, like you said, you're not giving a young woman's body a chance to even do what it has to do. But
Mhm.
even that is assuming a healthy state of body in the first place.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, a young girl going into her first menstruation cycle is probably already also inundated with endocrine disruptors in every other form. She's probably pumped full of sugar and high fructose corn syrup and artificial dyes and, wearing plastic clothing and all these things as well that kind of create the problem for the
Mhm.
sold so-called solution to be suggested, right? So
Yeah.
a young woman going into her first period might experience irregularities that aren't even natural, and that she might experience some issues or undue pain, etc.,
Yeah.
because her hormones are disrupted and her organs are disrupted from the get go. But then instead of actually getting to the root cause of what's happening, it's just blanket statement, bam, 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 pills, pills, pills. And then
Yeah.
obviously there's always the other excuses and reasons it's purported as well, not just for the regularity, but to hack away the built-in process of pregnancy. It's
Yeah.
a lot of they just there's a lot of reasons they end up just pushing that out, and it's very unfortunate. It's very unfortunate. And now, as we see the surge of women getting off of these things, there's of course the backlash from the systems that be saying it's all a conspiracy theory, that it's bad for you and this and that. Meanwhile, the women who have gone through this experiment suffered the consequences, woke up to it. They're being told, no, no, didn't exist, didn't happen. Sorry, goodbye. Yeah,
It's crazy.
it's certainly an important one, and it's an important conversation to have because you know I don't know if you've seen the movie The Matrix, but that's a quote from there, so in some part where it's like, people will fight to defend the system that enslaves them.
Mm-hmm.
And there's women out there experiencing the severe detriments to birth control,
Hmm.
or have women around them that have experienced,
Hmm.
yet fight. Like it's a personal thing for them. It's hugely important for them that
Hmm.
birth control continue to be purported upon society. Why is this? Why have people had this spell cast upon them so strongly? How did they wrap themselves into the minds of our women and our men to defend synthetic hormones? That's a broad scale question, so you can go any way.
Oh, that's a biggie. And like, listen, I am by no means anti-birth control across the board. I think it's very helpful and useful in some circumstances, in particular, um, some marginalized people, sometimes people who are in potentially traumatic or abusive situations. You know what I mean? Sometimes birth control is a good medicine and should and can be used in a healthy way. I do not believe that birth control should just be handed out like candy to everybody who has, quote, a problem, right? Just like any other medicine that's out there, right? Like antidepressants are kind of the same thing. Like before we're like, well, have you eaten good food? Have you been outside in the last week? Have you gotten off your phone? We're just like, oh, here's some antidepressants so you can better, right? It's a kind of the same thing. Like the medicine is good when it's necessary, right? When it's needed, but it's not needed all the time. So I have this theory that when did birth control come out? It came out during that first wave of feminism, right? Which I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but here we go. What was that first wave of feminism about? I'm not really sure it was about liberating women completely. I think it may have been a little bit about, wait a second, we, we, first side of a conspiracy theory coming, here it is. We can get women to do far more than they are doing now. Women can go work a 40-hour week and they can come home and manage the household all at the same time, right? And again, I do think that there were so many benefits to that first wave of feminism. Like it paved the way for me to be able to have this conversation with you today, right? Like, I mean, women couldn't have their own bank accounts back then. We had to have our husbands sign off on a bank account. We couldn't, it was just crazy. However, we were also kind of sold a bill of goods that we bought hook, line, and sinker, that we can just add more to our plates, right? That you can control your fertility so you can go do 20 more hours of labor outside of the house and then come home and do more. I'm not sure we had our thinking hats on when we not sure we as a culture had our thinking hats on when we bought into that, right? And again, I do feel that birth control can and should be used in a conscious, helpful way. There are some conditions, PCOS or endometriosis, some things that birth control actually does help women feel a little more comfortable, not have some of the symptoms that they have, right? But yeah, I think the turnaround that we're experiencing right now is a shift in overall consciousness, right? I think people are opening their eyes and deciding that I want a little more information before I buy in to a pill, before I buy into a system, a structure, a hierarchy, whatever it may be. And that's great. I think that's really great to make an informed choice, right? But I don't think, I don't know. I walk the middle path a lot. But I don't think we need to totally throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? There are times when that can be good medicine, but we need to be more informed consumers. And that's part of what I do. Nobody teaches people about their bodies in public school. God forbid, private school is probably even worse. I don't know. But I think at basis, we don't even know how our bodies work, right? These 12-year-olds getting prescribed birth control don't understand that, as you said, the endocrine disruptors may be playing a part, that maybe their body just hasn't enough time to do what it needs to do. So I think informed consent, embodied informed consent is the most important piece in all of this.
Yeah, I'm a realist and I'm a free market person. I don't have a problem with it being a product, but I don't think it's a product that 99% of the people that at least that are pushed it, have it pushed upon them should ever take, And so yeah, that's kind of my look. And it's an interesting historical pattern that has presented itself, that these social engineering movements
Mm-hmm.
that at the surface level are so beautiful. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
why wouldn't we want women to be able to do things? It's an interesting pattern and cycle that's repeated itself every single time, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
That the people behind those movements at the very top aren't actually looking out for those pawns that are being used and manipulated into thinking they want something. And the waves of feminism that have progressed as planned, because it
Mm-hmm.
takes baby steps to kind of manipulate a society. I think they themselves are responsible for much of the endocrine disruption that we see today as well, because essentially what they've done is have women behave like man. And can women behave like men and ever be connected to their natural rhythms and cycles and hormones? Because yes, there's beautiful things. Yes, the fact that women can do this and do that, great. But a lot of women haven't stopped to think, do I even want to do all that? Is doing
Mhm.
all this and that even sit right with me and allow me to exist the way I need to be? It's kind of a shame how much of a scam it's all been, and
Mm.
I think a lot of women are realizing now, again, whoa, we've been put through this experiment. I've been told I should do this and that I want this.
Mhm.
And actually, perhaps I don't.
Mhm.
No,
Mhm.
thank you. I just want to calm down, relax, honor my body, and live like women used to live more so. And it's an important conversation in regards to the cycles because women have been so masculinized. Now, simultaneously, there's a flip side that men have been feminized, and how this has also played into forcing women to become masculinized because they don't have true masculine figures around them to protect them. But on the women's side, you know, I understand why it's so difficult for a woman to honor her body and honor her femininity and honor her cycles when she's been told her whole life that she has to be masculine and led into being masculine, even without that word being used. And
Mm.
do you have any thoughts on the social engineering and the masculinization and the glamorization of women behaving in a masculine fashion and the role that's played in disrupting the cycles of those women?
Well, I have a lot of thoughts on this. I mean, this is a very binary discussion that we're having today, right? I fully believe in a full expression of the spectrum, right? So, as human beings, all of us have a spectrum of masculine, feminine, light and dark, yin and yang, whatever you want to call it. We have all of that within us, but maybe some of us are 25-75. Some of us are 95-5, whatever it may be. We can slide that slider along. And as people in female bodies, I think we have an advantage where we can embrace different archetypes or combinations of that. In particular, also, as we move through the trajectory of maiden, mother, crone, we embody different archetypes, right? A lot of women in their early 20s have this like go girl, like warrior archetype that they're embodying, right? We are like achieving, we're climbing our first mountain, if you will, right? Um, when we're younger, maybe we have those more maiden-like qualities, right? That kind of more Virgo expression, the virgin. When we're older, we give zero fucks. We are like in our wise woman years, and we don't need to bond with anybody, right? And like our hormones reflect that. When we move towards menopause, we start to lose estrogen and progesterone and oxytocin. Those are hormones that encourage us to want to bond to partners, to children. We start to lose those in our crone or wise woman years. We don't care as much about people pleasing like we did in our younger age, right? We don't care so much about caretaking our children. They've like flown the nest. They can do it on their own, right? We come into this phase of acceptance and I don't really know how to say it other than like giving less fucks about things, right? We know who we are. We can trust ourselves. Our discernment becomes much more clear. When we're younger, many people, when we're younger, we're kind of worried about fitting in and like pleasing the crowd and caretaking the children and making our partners happy. Um,
Are those
I
bad things?
That is a very personal question. I think I'll go back to what we started out this conversation with. We are herd animals, right? We're not meant to exist in a vacuum by ourselves. But I think there is light and shadow to all of these qualities, right? To being a caretaker is a beautiful one. I'm a mother, right? I get it. I have a partner. I have a husband. I want to caretake my family. I want to provide for them. I want to be that soft place for them to land. But I also want to be boundaried and draw a hard line and teach them good lessons and know who the fuck I am and to stand my ground on certain things. I don't want to be someone who will people please at the expense of having healthy boundaries. Do I get it right? Heck no. All of the time. Heck no. Um, but I think speaking of femininity, my idea of femininity is very personal, right? Femininity does not mean that we um, wear dresses and speak in a flowery manner and have our nails. I mean, look at me, my nails are a mess. Like, it does not mean that by any stretch of the imagination. It does not mean that we are always in a receptive mode. You think about the general archetypes of masculine, feminine. Feminine is receptive, and the masculine is penetrative, right? I mean, that's just like how the physiology works. It doesn't mean that we're always in a completely receptive position. We can move through those phases. In particular, like I said, on that 28-ish day cycle that women go through, we have a time where we're more focused, we're more driven, we're more sexual, we are more penetrative. In different parts of the cycle, we're more receptive, we're more internal, we're more reflective. So I really think, I mean, I got to tell you, I love men so much, but I do feel very fortunate to be a woman because I feel that I literally have an embodied approach to the full spectrum. I have access to the full spectrum of being a human throughout the month. And I wonder if it's a little bit trickier for people in male bodies to experience that full spectrum without really being conscious of it, right? Of course, you can be a woman and not be tapped into your cycle or those phases in any way. You can be completely unconscious, in particular if you're given hormonal birth control and your hormones are flatlined instead of being cyclical, right? Boy, I don't know if that answers your question. I don't even know.
Who knows what the question even was at that point? But
No rabbit hole.
you said a lot of good things, so still an answer. I love that you just said what you just said, in that you love being a woman and perhaps think being a man would be even worse, because I think there should be more of that. I think there should be more women loving being women, because the standard of society is everyone thinking that, being a man is better or easier or this, that, the other, whatever. And it kind of has women themselves feeling shame or feeling lesser or feeling inferior as women. And I think women should be happy to be women, and I think men should be happy to be men. Like, why would you not? And how can any other framework allow for optimal existence and most fulfilled existence, right? I think a woman should absolutely think, I can't imagine being a man, and I love this, and this is great, And I think men should behave the same in respective to, being a man. And so I just wanted to recognize that I think that's a beautiful thing that you feel, and I'm so happy that you said it and shared it with us as well. And I want to touch upon what you were mentioning prior to that. In essentially what you're describing is how the small-minded perspective that is prevalent constructs these false extreme dichotomies and boxes and constructs and thinks it has to only be over there or over there. You can be masculine or you can be feminine. And if you were masculine, as a woman, you have to go get her and shove, shave your hair and, oh, F man, I don't need them. I don't need no man. I'm strong, independent woman, blah, 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 all that garbage. Or there's also the construct of, you want me to be feminine? Like you said, I have to wear a dress all the time. I have to shut up and be quiet and not listen or only listen to everyone and never speak, blah, blah, blah. It's such a disservice to the beauty that is a woman being able to healthily navigate the spectrum of behavior in her own life. Because, like you so perfectly said, there is a spectrum that we all exist within, perhaps as a baseline, but then as we go throughout, not just our monthly cycle, but our days and our activities, there is certainly time and place for a woman to fall into her more feminine and have the most optimal and pleasant and enjoyable experience for herself. But then also there's times when embodying a little more masculine energy is appropriate and perhaps the optimal experience as well. it doesn't have to be these ridiculous dichotomized constructs of you're here or you're there. And what gets purported is the negatives only of a
Mhm.
woman being in her feminine, when perhaps a woman being in her feminine as a baseline, it's not a negative. It's beautiful. Does that make you think of anything? That's not
Well,
necessarily.
yeah, I mean, I think we should just be who we feel most comfortable being in our own skin, right? We shouldn't have to align with anybody else's idea of who we should be. If you like to, be a sister of the rose and, be, um, I don't know, whatever. Very, very typically feminine with the dresses and robes and long hair. Cool. If you want to shave your head and wear spike heels and a power suit to work every day, or you want to put on your work boots and your hard hat, cool, do that. Just own yourself, right? Own yourself in whatever it is. That's the most important piece.
I think where it gets interesting though is that the women that do embrace that femininity in extreme ways, I think they often get shamed in this modern society. And I think most of that shame comes from other women. What do you think's going on there?
So there's this whole, you want to talk about dichotomies. I love being a woman. We just talked about that, and I would not trade it for the world. There is some hard ass shit that we deal with as women, right?
Y'all are
We
vicious.
are either the virgin or the whore, right? There's like no in between, but you have to be both. You have to be ready and available and sexy, but you can't be too much, right? So you're like damned if you do, damned if you don't. That's, I think that ideal or that construct is what gets a lot of women confused, right? That you either have to be this or that. You were just saying it. You have to exist on either side of the spectrum. And you're either a prude or you're a whore, right? There's like no in between. There's no like, no, you're a good person who can enjoy sex and can go and, pursue partners of your choice when you want, or you're a nun in the convent. Like it just doesn't really exist that way. So I think that may be where a lot of this kind of stems from to begin with. Um, I'm not sure where the root of the sister wound comes from, right? Because it is very prevalent. When I was a younger person, I did not trust women. All of my friends were men, right? When I was in high school and even college. I don't know what I got to tell you, I think it was mothering, honestly, and meeting a community of other women who are going through this. Motherhood's beautiful, but is a wild ride, right? Meeting other women in that atmosphere where I was like, oh no, we should trust each other. We're having this experience together. We can support each other. I don't need to be doing the same exact routine as this other mother, right? Maybe I choose to breastfeed my baby. Maybe she chooses to bottle feed her baby, but we are both going through this wild ride together and can support each other and trust each other together. Um, I'm not, there's a lot of conspiracy theories out there on where that sister wound comes from. If it was kind of planted by men to keep women apart. Because let me tell you what, when women come together, we are powerful, right? We can move mountains. Most societies, if you look historically, many societies were matriarchal, right? I mean, they weren't led by men. Oh, I see you raising your eyebrow there. They weren't male-led societies, right? Like we're going way back. We're like cooking food over a fire we're talking about here. Um, Women are magical. We are literally the portals where fucking life comes through us, right? Where spirit and source and the physical body come together in our bodies. Like that's magical. Women were revered. You look at the cycle itself. Many societies revered women who were bleeding as these magical, intuitive, kind of like seers of the society, right? That's when a woman was most clear, where she could kind of intuit what the society, what the group of humans should be doing or moving towards, the decisions that for lack of a better term, the tribe should make. Yeah. So I'm not really sure if when we move towards a more agrarian society, if women were kind of like taught not to trust each other in some way, right? Like that was imparted in us at some point. And I think it's really because women are powerful, right? I mean, I think this world would be a much different place if it was run by women as opposed to being run by men. I love men. I'm not trying to like um kick dirt in anybody's face by any stretch of the imagination, but I think we have a unique advantage as women to make well-rounded decisions, cyclical based decisions, nuanced decisions, which might not be the same as some decisions that are made in a patriarchal society. So I think it was a construct, really, to tear women apart rather than
it's certainly been. Sorry, go finish up there. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, it is, I believe, a patriarchal construct that women should not trust each other. I don't think that sister wound came from women being like, I don't like her hair. I don't like how she dresses. I don't like how she does this or she does that. Because women traditionally came together. I mean, that's another advantage that we have that couple waves of feminism have brought us. Like, it is commonplace to see a women's circle, right? Like if you go to any coffee shop or whatever, you'll probably see some advertisement for a group of women coming together. You're doing men's work. How often do you see a men's group or a men's circle where men can sit and share their feelings and be vulnerable and be fucking, I mean, being vulnerable, in my opinion, is masculine as fuck, like to be able to share what's on your heart and, I don't know. Again, that's where women have an advantage today. Like men really have to seek those groups and that support system out. It's a little bit easier for women to find that. I think we're starting to repair those wounds where we've separated each other. I don't know.
Yeah, before we get too far off, I just want to address and introduce some important caveats to what you were saying. I think it's important when we talk about things that have been purported upon society and purported upon women and introduced as constructs, that it wasn't blanket statement men that did this to women. That the average man living amongst these women is just as much the victim of the societal manipulation as the women. And I think that, yes, the corruption of women, to say blatantly, is a weapon that was used against men as well, because they're suffering out there too with the state of everything.
Well, that's true.
It's important to understand that it's not men that did this. It's perhaps some men, a group of men that were in power and making decisions, this and that. But it doesn't mean that men did this. So that's an important part to introduce to the conversation, because it's important to remember that we as men and women are in this together. And those that have fallen under the ruling and the structuring that certain people have built, it's not just a blanket statement that, it's just important to not fall into that, let's, get divided and be conquered kind of thing. And yeah, if I'm not a historian, I have difficulty trusting history written by anyone or said by anyone. If I didn't see it, it is what it is. I'm not there. It is here and now, so perhaps there were matriarchal societies, perhaps not, I don't know. But would decisions be made differently if they were made by women? Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Would that be a good thing? Can women be trusted to make stable decisions if they themselves are experiencing cycles? Perhaps, only in certain areas of their cycle would they be making the better decisions, and so that's just a healthy, respectable pushback on, would women be better decision makers overall? Perhaps sometimes. And then perhaps if their emotionality overtook them, then it would be worse, so it's an interesting experiment, but we are certainly now seeing more women leaders in all fronts. But it's interesting that you also recognize in today's age that there's a lot of things that are easier for women as well.
Mhm.
The men of today are kind of the lost group, and especially if you're a straight white man. There's just a lost group where if nobody wants to help them, they're kind of demonized, and then oh, you got a problem, oh, you're privileged, suck it up, whatever. It's an interesting thing that's occurred. But yeah, the loss of brotherhood has
Mhm.
happened and is so detrimental to society because it takes men getting together, not necessarily to be vulnerable and talk about themselves all the time, but like, yeah, that could be part of it, supporting each other in times of stress as well. But yeah, the loss of true brotherhood is something that is detrimental to all of society, men and women alike. And to branch off of my original point of talking about how certain things are more available to women than others, than they are to men. I just I think that men have failed women on a broad spectrum. I think men, as the protectors of society, have failed and allowed the manipulation to occur that has been the detriment to everybody. And so I think women can only exist within the society that men allow to be constructed or deconstructed, even. And so I think it's important to come together and understand how both genders have been misled and led astray from their beautiful innate masculinity and femininity, and really come together to figure it all out and observe the history of what did occur and how we did get so far off what was natural, and understand that just because something's modern doesn't mean it's good. That there's a lot of interesting, things that we've been led to believe are the ways to be that just perpetuate the suffering of everybody.
Mhm.
Um, there was a question in there I had for you, but I forget now.
That's okay. I've got a response. Don't
Yeah,
worry.
go ahead. Go ahead.
Of course, I've got a response. I 100% unity across the board is the solution, right? Not dividing people further, not dividing groups of women, not dividing groups of men. Unity, harmony is the solution, right? It's not putting all the women in power. It's not putting all the men in power. And I think it's really important, like you said, to examine the history, to understand where we come from, so we can do better in the future, so we can do better in the now and the future. Um, I'm not sure, again, neither one of us are historians. I don't know where the disruption happened. But I do know if we look at the history, it's typically most often white men of European descent that have oppressed other people. I mean, that's not across the board, right? There's a lot of oppression happening everywhere. Um, why is that? Right? Why have women not been the oppressors of society? Why have women not been the ones to dominate society? Right? I think that's an important question to ask. I'm not saying I have the answer right
Yeah.
now.
Perhaps it is just the natural order.
It's an observation, right? I don't know if it's the natural order.
If it always has been and currently is, perhaps it always will be. Perhaps it's just the way things are, that men lead and women not follow as a bad thing, but women, are subject to the leadership or lack thereof of the men around them.
I mean, I think I really appreciate your point, that it's not necessarily personal accountability, but overall accountability, speaking for men, that men have failed women. Because I think that's really important to be able to acknowledge some of the some of the truths here, right? Like, let's look at birth control. Another reason I don't like birth control is because it's founded on some insanely racist principles, right? Like Margaret Sanger was a fucking racist. And they were experimenting on women of color to come up with birth control. It was a means to control a population of people. That is what birth control is founded out. And that's like one of the most disgusting parts of it, right? We have to acknowledge that while we restructure how birth control is used as a whole. Right. So similarly, I think we need to make those acknowledgments on how we address leadership in our society today. Okay, cool. Maybe men have typically taken those leadership roles, but you know what? I'm a woman leader. There's a lot of other women leaders out there that I know of that could really affect change in our society. I mean, I used to do a lot of demonstrations. I used to wave a lot of flags in my younger years. I'm like a mom. I'm a person who's more like, you know what? I want to lead by example than lead by becoming the next senator in New York State or whatever it might be, right? But I think it's really important that we look back and we figure out where that became off kilter. I mean, we look at the Americas, the Haudenosaunee people was a matriarchal society, right? That was a huge federation of people before Europeans came over here. I mean, a huge federation. I can't give you the numbers of how many people did live in the lands of the Northeast, but it was a matriarchal society. The women were very involved in making decisions and keeping those five nations organized, right? I don't know when or how the breakdown happened. I'm not sure. I mean, I don't really know much about pagan societies in Europe or anything like that. That's not my area of expertise by any stretch. But I think it is important to examine. You know, I'm not sure it has always been that men were leaders and women were not.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. It's, again, history is such an interesting thing. And just to the point that you raised earlier, not to, it has to be something that we go back and forth on, but just to add my piece into it, it's an interesting historical observation. Also, while perhaps it appears that, white men have done this, that, the other thing, and whatever, I think simultaneously gets ignored that every other ethnicity has done the same thing. Perhaps they haven't been as good at it. Perhaps they haven't succeeded. Perhaps they're currently being dominated. I think there's always been the waves and cycles of different cultures being more dominant than others. I think there's also the very interesting phenomena, without going into it too much, of certain groups masquerading as white European races and then doing certain things to blame it on the white people because they themselves hate the white people, but we'll leave it at that and people can explore that historically if they want. But in these closing minutes, how can women who hear all this scary stuff, a lot of this crazy stuff going on, how can they move forward in a way in 2024 that does honor their body and that does honor their cycles? What are some steps a woman can take that would just like to feel more fulfilled or get more healthy or get more out of life?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to tell you, it's not flashy, it's not sexy, it's not exciting, but the most basic thing you can do, the first step you can take is learn how your body works, right? I mean, talk to a person like me, get an anatomy, a physiology book. There is no shortage of beautiful literature out there on how your cycle, how your hormones work. Let me try to think. Well, I won't list any books right now, but that's step one, is learning how your body works. Two, I always encourage women to track your cycles literally with a pen and paper in a journal. No period tracking apps, no outsourcing, no giving your data away to whatever. Learn how to track your cycle with a pen and a paper. You will learn so much about your body, right? You will learn so much about your emotions, so much about your periods of production and your periods of rest, right? So I always encourage people to just like get back to basics, just like learn how it works, learn what your hormones do, what they are. I mean, the funny thing is, men and women, you have estrogen, I have testosterone, right? Like we share the same hormones. They're just in different levels. I encourage men to learn about how women's bodies work. I encourage women to learn how men's bodies work. Obviously, focus on your own system first. That's, the best place to start. So yeah, I mean, again, it's like not sexy, it's boring, it's anatomy and physiology, but it is the basics. We got to get back to basics. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think simultaneously with that would be observing how certain things kind of interact with that cycle or perhaps alter it or disrupt it. And certainly a great actionable at all points in time for all people is to be conscious of what our diet is. And then when I say diet, I don't just mean food. I mean all things that we are consuming in the form of, like we were talking about, body products and water and food and chemicals around our house, because all of these things can potentially and are very likely disrupting that sensitive cycle, that
Yeah.
very sensitive cycle. And so once we strip away those things, can we really thrive in our own hormones and then fully comprehend them, you know? And I think that is a key element as well, because it really will allow what is meant to be to flourish. And so, how is it that you work with people? You know, you do a lot of different things. I think you teach classes, you perhaps do personal coaching. How is it specifically that you're doing this type of advisement and work? And how can people contact you?
Yeah. There's multiple ways to get involved. I teach women about their cycles and how to track them with that pen and paper method. I teach folks about living and existing in the natural world around them. Again, one of my best pieces of advice, whether I'm teaching folks how to garden or I'm teaching people about their cycles, is to make observations. That's it. Just make observations and write them down every day, right? Like we go around our world unconscious, but yeah, I teach classes to men about women's bodies, about how their cycles work, about desire, about sexuality, the whole nine yards. I do individual coaching. I do astrological coaching, which is kind of using the system of astrology to help steer a spiritual practice or to help steer your life in general. Um, and yeah, I mean, the best way to get a hold of me is probably Instagram or my website, Cycle Alchemist on Instagram, or TereMarieMartini.com, TERE, MarieMartini.com. Yeah, I think that's just about it.
Awesome. And so I asked you one important question in what women can do moving forward to honor their cycles and their bodies. But I'll ask you the same question for men. What can men do as an actionable if they'd like to honor the cycles and the health of the women around them?
Mhm. Mhm. If you have a particular person, woman in your life, whether it's a partner or a sister or a mom or a daughter, ask questions. Just one question a day. How are you feeling today? Right? If you want to honor or learn more about her body, her seasons, her cycles, simply ask that question. How are you feeling today? Maybe it's a one-word response. Joyful. I feel grief. I feel exuberance. Whatever it is, right? Maybe if you have a partner, you engage in a journaling practice together, right? Where you could get an agenda and just write the one word in every day of the week that she gives to you. Um, there's a lot of beautiful practices you could do as a couple, right? Like just go out and take a walk, take a 5, 10, 20-minute walk together in nature. It doesn't have to be at a park or, on 400 acres somewhere. It could be at a city park or just around the block in your neighborhood, whatever it is. And maybe you both come together and just share your experience. What did you observe on our walk today, right? I mean, that just helps you both anchor into the natural systems that surround both of you. That's not necessarily just about her body, but about what your bodies are experiencing together. So
That's beautiful. Connection with self, connection with our loved ones, connection with nature, and how these are all connected with each other. It's certainly a beautiful message. And so, amongst all these beautiful messages that we've given our audience today, is there any one particular that you'd like to leave off with?
Hmm. Again, I will just go back to how we opened up this conversation with that idea of sovereignty and agency, right? That we live in a society full of constructs and hierarchies and systems, but we have choice in them, right? We have choice how we want to lead our lives, whether it's a small or seemingly small choice of how many cups of coffee we drink that day, or something larger. If we choose to homeschool our children or send them to public school, right? If we choose to be self-employed or be part of the corporate ladder, whatever that may be, just anchor into that. You have agency in your life. You can create the life that you desire, but you have to be a responsible, accountable agent to your own person. Yeah.
Absolutely. On the flip side of taking utter responsibility for everything that we experience in life is the ultimate beauty, which is empowerment. And though there might be a lot of things out there that are doing you dirty, there might be a bit of good, but a whole lot of bad and ugly. It's your responsibility to navigate this world and get the results that you do. Feeling like a victim is never productive.
Victors, not victims. We are victors of our own stories. Yeah.
Absolutely. But only as much as we allow ourselves to be. Great.
Amen.
Thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thanks, Zach. Great chat.
A really big thank you goes out to Tree for coming on the show. You know, it's a really fun topic because I think a lot of people are stuck in the hard physical side of this reality. And I understand why. I understand that it's more so what we're taught about, and it's the easier thing to see. But I think the real magic of life, the real whimsy, is in the study and the comprehension of the cycles of life. The waves, frequencies, vibrations that govern the natural universe, the earth itself, our biological bodies, our thoughts, our emotions, and really everything in between. And I think if more people took the time to study and understand the more watery side of things and weren't so stuck in the hard earth element, we'd see a very different world, and for the better. And I think that's why there might be a particular vested interest in keeping people in a state of denial of the more esoteric, more metaphysical sides of life, mocking it, putting down those that study or talk about the importance, emphasize these things that simultaneously cannot necessarily be seen with our physical eyes, but are ever present. And once one's eyes are open to seeing such things, it seems they cannot be unseen, and they start to present themselves in every aspect and element of life. Now, if you're someone who has no idea what I'm talking about, and this doesn't resonate with you, probably sound pretty crazy right about now, and that's all right. I very much would have agreed with you at some point along my way, but here we are, and you're listening to my podcast, so you're at least somewhat open-minded. But again, big thank you goes out to Tree for exploring a bit of the magic of life in this conversation. And a big thank you goes to her for the help that she provides to help people understand themselves and the world around them in a more deep and meaningful way. In that way, she really does make the world a bit of a better place, even if it's one person at a time. I hope you, the audience member, has enjoyed listening to this episode. Do make sure that you're subscribed to the channel wherever you're listening, so you get notified about the new episodes when they get published. Plenty more coming your way. You're listening to the Health King's Court. Ancient wisdom, modern health.